Good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Steve Cowley. I was the acting director until a few hours ago. And our new director, Sir Charles Godfrey, is in the front row, but he said this should be my last act, and here it goes. Today's topic, I think, would have been very special, and James Martin would love to have been sitting in the audience for today's topic. It's just the kind of thing that this school was founded for, thinking about the problems of the future, thinking about the solutions of the future, and that's what the Martin School is about. And it's not for me to introduce the speaker, it's for me to introduce the Vice-Chancellor for Education, who's going to be our compere, our coordinator today, Martin Williams, who's an engineer, which is a really good thing, and Martin.
So good evening, everybody. Yes, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Joseph Aoun. Professor Aoun is the 7th president of Northeastern University. He's an internationally renowned expert in linguistics with higher degrees from MIT, Paris, and the St. Joseph University in Beirut. And prior to his role at Northeastern, he was the inaugural holder of the Anna H. Bing Dean's Chair at the University of Southern California. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques from the French government. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His university, Northeastern, is a world leader in the delivery of experiential learning, that is, taking students out of the classroom to learn through immersion in a professional environment. And they do this through what they call co-op, cooperative education and career development. And I'm sure we're going to hear more of that and its relevance to the future of higher education in the course of this evening. So obviously the subject of tonight's talk is the impact of AI on what we all do. And I'm sure we're all aware of the rapidly developing impact of artificial intelligence on our lives. And I think the media coverage we see veers between excitement at the possibilities that the technology offers to doom-laden predictions of the future of work. And Oxford, of course, is very active in contributing to this discussion and contributing to research in this area in many respects. For instance, we have a world-leading group on the development of autonomous vehicles and navigation, looking at the technology side. We also have a Martin School program on technology and employment that's thinking about the likely consequences. But what Professor Aoun is going to talk about specifically is how universities should respond to the rise of the robots in the way they prepare students for the future. And he set this out in a very fascinating book called Robot Proof. He's going to briefly introduce the key arguments now, and then I'll ask him a few questions before I'm hoping we'll have lots of audience interaction. He's very keen to engage with as many of you as possible, so I'll plan to leave about half of our session for a Q&A from the audience. But without further ado, if I could introduce Professor Aoun to start us off.
Thank you, and good evening. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be with all of you, and Professor Richardson, whom I knew from the United States. It's an honor to be with you here again. Thank you, Professor Williams, for this brief introduction. I think it's too brief. But I understand why you want to keep the time for the questions and for the discussion and so on. But thank you. Professor Gowdy, thank you for also hosting us and for hosting me for the last time. And Sir Charles Godfrey, welcome to your new school, if I may, if I'm not presumptuous. Well, let me start by mentioning that the research that has been done here at the Martin School has been influential, not only on, influential on the book and my thinking, but also at large in the United States, because the studies that you have launched projected that close to 50% of the jobs that we know will disappear in the next 20 years. Some studies are saying, and including your own, are saying, no, maybe it's going to be less than 50%. That doesn't matter. What matters is that we are going to see an enormous sea change. Jobs are going to become obsolete, and new jobs and new professions are going to be created. Now, what are the consequences of that? The consequences of that is that people are going to be left out of this economy if we do not step in. We in higher education, we do not step in and assume the responsibility to make people robot-proof. And therefore, how are we going to make people or help people become robot-proof? This is going to be a journey. It is not a specific point. It is not going to be captured during 3 years where we have the students with us. It's going to be a journey, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more. In the book, I start by providing a blueprint for how higher education can help learners become robot-proof. The first, I focus on the group of learners that essentially are full-time learners in colleges. I call them students or learners who are long on time and short on experience. And therefore the question becomes, what kind of curricula are we going to provide that will help them become robot-proof? And what I mention is something we call Humanics, a curriculum that is called Humanics. What is Humanics? The Humanics is the integration of 3 literacies. What I am saying is that every learner needs to master and integrate 3 literacies: a technological literacy, a data literacy, and a human literacy. The technological literacy is a literacy that will allow the learner to understand machines, how they function, and how to interact with machines. The data literacy will allow the learner to navigate the sea of information that is generated by these machines. And the third literacy, the human literacy, is the literacy that will allow the learner to focus on what makes humans unique: the ability to be innovative, creative, the ability to be entrepreneurial, culturally agile, empathetic. And it is the integration of the 3 literacies that is the beginning of your journey as a learner. But in order to achieve that, you can talk a lot about empathy. You can talk about innovation. You can talk a lot about entrepreneurship, cultural agility. You have to live it. And this is where experiential education will allow you to start integrating the classroom experience with the world experience through long-term internships. And the integration is key. They will allow you also to start understanding you as a learner, who you are, what you're good at, what you are not good at, how you interact with others. You see the opportunities that will allow you to innovate. And also, this is where you start transferring and applying your knowledge in different contexts. For the learning specialist, this is the beginning of what we call far transfers. So we start with the curriculum, Humanics. How to make it a reality through experiential education. As I mentioned, being robot-proof is a journey, which means that, in fact, the world will change constantly. Machines will become better, artificial systems will become more performant, and they will displace more jobs, and there will be more jobs created. Which means that we, as human beings, we will have to re-educate ourselves constantly. We will have to reskill ourselves, acquire new skills, upskill ourselves, and move into new domains. Who is doing that? Lifelong learning is a necessity. Higher education has not moved into lifelong learning and has not considered lifelong learning as a core mission. That's why you are seeing two phenomena, at least in the United States, but it's not restricted to the United States. You are seeing for-profits stepping in and saying, I am going to provide lifelong learning opportunities. And you are seeing companies establishing universities, the IBMs of this world, and you know many of them. And when you ask them, when you talk to them, they say, this is not our core competence. We do not want to do it. We prefer that you do it, but you are not meeting our needs, and that's why we're doing it. So higher education has to move into lifelong learning, embrace it, and should not consider that as a second-class endeavor. But if we do that, we will have to rethink the way we conduct ourselves. We cannot build curricula and we say they will come. People, the second group that I'm talking about, who need lifelong learning, are people who are long on experience, short on time. So we have to devise curricula that will meet their needs and be delivered to them where they are, whether they're in the workplace or in their bedroom. And we cannot ask them to commit for a long period. The notion of certificates, badges, stackable certificates should be there. Even the notion of who owns the curriculum should be rethought, because with lifelong learners, you have to sit down with the employers, you have to sit down with the learners and ask, what are you seeking? What are your goals? We don't own the curriculum, we co-own it. So it's going to be a large departure for higher education. But to close, the world is changing dramatically. This is not the first time it has happened. There is an AI revolution, and higher education has the opportunity and the obligation to step in and make us all robot-proof. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for your book, which I enjoyed enormously. I'm just going to ask you a few questions. Could I start, before we get into talking about universities, talking a bit more about the technological change that we're confronting? As I said at the start, there's a mix of predictions ranging from look at all these wonderful possibilities that are opening up to us to the doom-laden prognostications about the future of work.
There is a section in your book where you look back at previous technological changes, such as the Industrial Revolution, and say that, okay, this was a disruptive time, and certain forms of work disappeared, but others emerged, and we came through it. So are you predicting that that's not going to happen this time? Or are we in a position to know?
If you look at the previous disruptions, higher education played a big role in smoothing these disruptions and preparing people for these disruptions. During the Industrial Revolution, this is in the United States, for instance. After that, you saw, in the UK and in the United States. Am I? What do I have to do? Did I lose my mic? Oh, I lost my mic. See, you made me robot-proof. Thank you. Is this better? Universities played a role worldwide in smoothing the disruptions by accepting those disruptions and preparing people to be ready to be workers, to be professionals, to be creators in this context. And what I am saying is that the same is going to happen here, and this is why higher education has to step in. Now, I am not saying that jobs will be disrupted and disappearing. You are saying that here at the Martin School. And I'm not saying that there will be enough new jobs. No one really knows. But I am saying that there will be winners and losers. And that's what is frightening. And the winners are those who can retool, redefine themselves, re-educate themselves. And this has to be done with us, educators. Otherwise, it's going to be done without us.
Sure, thank you. I think an interesting aspect of your recipe for how higher education needs to evolve is that in some ways, it seems to me, it's emphasising quite traditional disciplines. So you're saying that what people are going to need in the future are good people skills, cultural flexibility, critical thinking. But to an extent, one could say that the emergence of technology has seen higher education evolving in the other direction, looking at use of digital resources in the classroom, using the internet for distance learning, MOOCs and so on. So are we going in completely the wrong direction at the moment, do you think?
No, I think we are pitting one against the other, one approach against the other. And what Humanics is about is about integration of the three literacies, the tech literacy, the data literacy, and the human literacy. So it's not enough to master engineering problems. And it's not enough to be a pure liberal arts major. You need to integrate the three literacies, whether it's in your thinking or in your research or in your practice or as a learner. And in general, going beyond that, we in higher education have created a dichotomy between learning to live and learning to earn a living. This dichotomy is now being questioned, because if you lose everything, if you lose your job, if you lose your profession, you're mid-career, you need to be relevant to yourself, and you need a new journey. So that's why I'm talking about the integration, and that's why I'm talking about a lifelong learning.
So there's an argument that essentially graduates need to be multi-skilled and flexible. So does that mean, I know you're talking about a very radical change in the way we do higher education, but looking at what the earliest changes might be, does that mean that the very vocational courses might be the most vulnerable to change?
Absolutely.
Things like law,
Absolutely.
engineering, medicine.
Absolutely. I mean, but in general, you can you can adopt the following generalization. If a job can be subject to a process, can be turned into a process, this job is at risk.
Yeah.
That's a generalization.
Sure.
And therefore, even in medicine, parts of, some endeavors in medicine, including surgery, people are projecting that they'll be automated. Stock picking, accounting, part of the legal profession. Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to quote you a few sections of your book. The first one I picked out was about how we need to change what we teach. You had a nice phrase: teachers need to expose the underlying fabric of learning to their students, like turning a sweater inside out. But then you go on to say, syllabi should describe the 4 cognitive capacities, so these are critical thinking, yes, cultural agility, and so on. Through each step of study and discussion, each lecture would include a clear learning outcome along these lines. Does our approach need to be that prescriptive? I'm wondering if there's rather than the sort of transformational approach and saying we've really got to headline these things, one can do it more through a sort of nudge approach of saying, well, these are the underlying skills that we're imparting through a lot of our education already, and we can sort of evolve in that direction without making it too explicit and disruptive.
Yeah, let me mention, allow me to mention an example from my own institution. Mm-hmm. We worked with the learning specialists we have to start to have an app that will be a coach for life with you, mm-hmm, as a learner. So you, from day one, will specify with your coach, with the app and your advisor, what your goals are in terms of learning. What are the gaps that you have? What are you trying to achieve? And then once we map a journey, this coach is going to give you the opportunities to look at the courses, to look at experiential endeavors, and to give you the possibilities. And once you are within them, then you yourself become the actor, that will assess your progress, your journey. So this could be read as an obligation for the teacher, whereas we are doing it in a different way. What we are really saying is that the learner herself has to become in charge, and we will become the coaches, and including this app that will remain with you for life. So the app will help you assess your goals and how you are progressing, and will allow you to track your progress. That's what I meant.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And this app, we tested that with 1,000 students. Next year, we're going to have it with all our students and all our lifelong learners too, all our alumni too. So it will be with you.
Right, okay.
And I'll be happy to offer you one.
Thank you. Now, this being Oxford, I think I can't have a discussion about education without mentioning the Oxford tutorial system, which you're probably aware of.
Absolutely.
A big focus of our undergraduate education is this weekly, very small group teaching with 1 or 2 students with a senior academic, where the students are defending, discussing an essay or a piece of analysis, responding to criticism. So I think we think this is an important part of what we give to students in promoting critical thinking, mental agility, lateral thinking. I wonder how resilient you think that approach is to the sort of change we're going through.
If you look at it from the point of view of the learning process, every learning process has essentially, I apologize for simplifying, has 3 steps. A step is acquisition. The second step is integration. And the third step is application and transfer. And the best transfer will be the far transfer, where you take your knowledge and you apply it to completely different domains. You know, you studied, for instance, you know, a great author, and then based on this work, you launch a marketing campaign for a company, which is a very far transfer. That's the type. From this perspective, if you look at acquisition, integration, and application, it is clear that what you have, your approach, is going to help you with the first two endeavors, for sure. And therefore, it fulfills a purpose. Now, this is a luxury for many institutions, but you can afford this luxury. I would also mention that the third aspect, which is to go into the experiential part, could be very beneficial too.
So, and I think, of course, our student experience, in common with many others, it is evolving to place a greater emphasis on internships. We don't have compulsory internships as parts of our courses, but an awful lot of our students do them now. Our careers service is very active in promoting them. I wonder if you could say a bit about how the way you do this at Northeastern differs from a summer internship. You seem to see it very much as an integral part of students' learning, in which case, presumably, you're setting it up in a way that you're very much designing the experiential part of the course with specific learning goals. How do you do that? How do you monitor them? Is there a formal assessment of it?
Yeah. Let me start with a small anecdote. During the recession in the United States, we saw that the summer internships took a big hit, whereas our long-term internships that we call co-ops went up dramatically, and I didn't understand why. So we talked to employers, we talked to CEOs, etc., and they said, look, the summer internships for us are too short because we train the person for 1 month, the second month she disappears. Whereas with your internships, your co-ops, they are there for up to 6 months. Mm-hmm. But now to go back to your question, what we are not interested in is to provide internships. We have internships now in 146 countries and 3,000 employers and NGOs worldwide. But we're not interested in that. We're interested in making that as part of our learning approach, the experiential education, which means that before the learners go, they have to understand why they are interested in these companies or NGOs or organizations. We work with them on sharpening this aspect and saying why also they are relevant. And once they are there, we have a mentor in the organization, mentoring them and relaying the work with us and to us. And at the same time, when they come back, we do the integration in the classroom. So the classroom will prepare you before, and the integration will happen before, during, and after. So to give you an example, suppose that you are a student and doing your co-op in Nepal or in Shanghai or in Cape Town. And you have a professor who is going to talk about you came back from Shanghai and the professor is going to talk about the economy, about pollution, about what's happening in China. You are going to question this professor because you lived it, and because you went out of your comfort zone. And now it's time for you to get your professor out of the comfort zone. So it becomes this learning process that you have here is duplicated and replicated in a different way, because you are bringing back your experience to the classroom. You took your classroom to the world, and now you're bringing back your experience to the classroom. So it's a dialectic endeavor.
So what you have at Northeastern seems extraordinary to me, and the amount of work to get that system established and working, I can only imagine. To what extent do you think that is reproducible?
Look, we have been doing it for 100 years. We took it on a global scale for the last 12, 15 years. Whenever you look at a change, you look at the barrier to entry. And you ask yourself, what is the barrier to entry? The barrier to entry is not to have a huge infrastructure, etc. You have a huge infrastructure. You have connections. You have a network. You have companies, NGOs that you launched that work with you. You have alumni. You have parents. That's your network. So that's not, you can also have people work on that. The barrier to entry is really ultimately us educators. Do we want to move into experiential education? Do we want to move into internships? That's not interesting. That's not interesting. It can be done by anybody. But do we want to have an experiential education where we're integrating those two components? That's a different matter. And that's where I see the barrier to entry. The barrier to entry is us. We're very conservative because we want to be at the center of the learning process. Whereas here, we are ceding the stage to the learner.
And I think we worry about quality control. If you're essentially outsourcing responsibility for the student experience.
Quite the opposite. That's where we become more relevant. That's where, if you are ceding the center stage to the student and to the learner, then what is the function, what is the role of a professor? It's quality control.
Yeah.
They're quite the opposite. But now, our job in terms of making, quality and pervasive is becoming more complex, because the type of internship has to be relevant, the experience has to be relevant, the integration has to be relevant. Whereas before, we just say, I'm giving you quality because I'm lecturing. Whereas here now we are saying, has this experience enhanced the knowledge, enhanced the goals, enhanced the humanics? And if we can point and have a real assessment, that's a much more complicated endeavor for us, because we have to put up with the world.
I think I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions and then throw it open to the audience. One, looking at it from a self-interested point of view. How do you see the impact of the sort of change in university education that you're talking about on an academic career? I'm thinking particularly, for instance, that leading universities generally place a very high value on the synergy between research and teaching, that very bright students being taught by research leaders, people very active in research, brings benefits both to the research and to the teaching. Your model, research still exists, but there's no doubt that the sort of teaching you're envisaging, it seems to me, is more intensive, that the balance of the workload of the academic
it's not more intensive, because essentially, let's start with research. Research is an experiential endeavor. Mm-hmm. So when the students are working on knowledge discovery with you, you spend a lot of time integrating what they do as part of the learning experience, correct?
Yeah.
It's the same thing that happens with the internships. It's simply taking the experiential education and say experience matters, and experience doesn't happen only in the classroom. Experience doesn't happen only on campus. It has to happen on campus through research, through the various activities, the clubs that the students lead, etc. That's also part of a learning. When you launch a new club, when you launch a new endeavor. And similarly with the internships. So it's not more intensive, actually, because you want the teachers, scholars to remain.
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, a different question that you ask, given the changes, will this remain? That's a different matter. We can discuss that. But this is doesn't lead you to more intensive teaching. It leads you to a different type of teaching, where you're not the center.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. I think at this stage I'm going to start inviting questions from the audience. I have one right behind you straight away.
Just to say that this is being filmed and live webcast, so just bear that in mind when you ask the question, that you will be heard around the world.
Thank you. Very interesting. The things that's worrying me is, these machines, you call them robots, but they're apparently not necessarily going to be a physical thing. They're, just on waves, are going to be super intelligent, and they're going to be able to make more super intelligent machines themselves. They're going to
Absolutely.
make them. So what is actually going to happen to the human being, whether it's a student or a teacher, in this situation? How can we kind of control them in some way that's going to be beneficial to everybody?
I think you're raising two questions. One is what was going to happen to us, human beings, and the other is how to control the machines. And those are two different questions. The one about what's going to happen to us is that we cannot and should not compete with machines. What I tried to do in the book is to provide a discussion of where humans are unique and machines cannot duplicate that. That's the first aspect. That's why the focusing is on what makes us unique with respect to machines. If we compete with machines, we lose. But if they compete with us, they lose. That's the first point. The second point is much more complex. How to control that. And, how to control machines. And I'm not an expert in this, but I can tell you there is a very strong discussion going back and forth in the UK, in the US, and all over the world about controlling machines, starting with a great physicist you have to entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley working together to regulate machines. Ultimately, when history showed us, especially in the last 200 years, that when you want to regulate something, you are not really solving the issue. Let me give you another example that is worrisome. And at the same time is a great change. Gene editing, CRISPR. Well, it's a great change for us, humans. It has profound implications, some positive, some negative. So suppose we start by regulating that, and there is now active discussion to regulate that. Other countries will step in and run with it. Now, what do? You start bringing the other countries together, but you cannot bring the whole world. So I'm really worried about regulations by fiat. I'm much more interested in trying to put tools that will, for instance, allow us to understand how machines are building other algorithms and building themselves, etc. And there is a whole field discussing that now. That's half an answer to the second point.
Thank you. has.
Thank you. There seems to be a practical problem that's going to arise very, very quickly, and that is that one simply doesn't know whether AI has been used if you're interacting with a machine of some kind.
Absolutely.
You don't know if AI has been incorporated or not. I mean, at the moment, you can do a search on Google and you get unbelievable results. So who's going to know when Google has made or somebody else has made a move to include an AI facility?
You know, this, once again, this is a personal, you know, I'm not an expert, but I landed at Heathrow, around 7 o'clock this morning, and I saw an ad by a Chinese phone company saying, you have AI with you in your phone, so why don't you assume that you have AI everywhere? Assume that. Because are you carrying a cell phone?
Yes.
Yes, you have AI. So you know.
Mine's too old.
Yeah, but still, you know, whenever you do a transaction, we code everything about you, correct? Or they code everything. So you have it. It's ubiquitous.
Thank you. We'll take a question from towards the back.
Hi, thank you, Professor Aoun. This was fascinating. I'm actually here from the United States. And so the concern, because I think it's wonderful, I think this idea of experiential learning is wonderful. I'm a professor at a state university in Los Angeles. And one of my concerns that's raised here are issues around access, equity, and disparity. This idea of these immersive learning experiences, for example, the university I'm at, is impossible for 75% of students who are working full-time to support their education. So is there a concern that if this has to be the response to what's coming as sort of a technological revolution, we're going to take an already widening disparity gap, not only in the United States, but I would argue in the rest of the world, and now make this worse because the models you're suggesting, could they honestly and realistically be supported by American and, frankly, British models of education?
Let me start with the study that I referenced that was generated here by the Martin School, saying that, you know, jobs will disappear, many jobs, close to 50% in the next 20 years. Therefore, what is going to happen if if people cannot, if they lose their jobs, inequality is going to increase. So let's start with that. The second thing that you're saying is that, is this model costly? That's what you're asking. And the answer is no. Let me give you an example. We worked for lifelong learners, namely people who are in who are in professional settings. And we launched intensive, we call them boot camps, in data analytics for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, while they are working, etc. And we put an experiential, in everything we do, we have an experiential dimension. This didn't increase the cost, it increased the outcome. So I don't think that this model is costly. We tested it with full-time. We tested it with, lifelong learners who are with us for certificates. And we had various institutions launch it. We even embedded that as an experimental approach with some institutions, companies like GE, etc. And, clearly for them it wasn't the cost, it was the benefit. So when you raise the question, I agree with you. We cannot afford to raise the cost. But is this model costly? And the answer is no. Actually, you can do the reverse, and I won't do it here today, but you can reverse the argument and saying this model will reduce cost. Because ultimately also the interns are being paid. But I will not go there.
I'm John Huffmeyer from the Center for Mutual and Employee-Owned Business. I have a question also about experiential learning, and I think I'm coming at this issue from completely the opposite perspective of the professor from Cal State. If you look at the coalition government's changes around student debt in this country, and perhaps you could speak to student debt in the United States, isn't experiential learning, especially when you can have students be paid for some of this experiential learning, actually a way to create greater quality through education?
Yeah, I agree with you. That's what I implied in my second part of the answer. Yes. And the answer is yes. I agree.
Let's take one at the back and then this one here.
Hi, I'm here. You said that higher education is the key to make people robot-proof, but what about those who don't pursue higher education? How do we robot-proof them, and should we?
Okay, the answer is the following. Higher education has to go to the learners wherever they are. I'm talking about the lifelong learners. So in the book I discussed the part. You are going to see more what I call multi-universities, namely universities with multiple centers, focusing on lifelong learning. We have done that. We are in Silicon Valley, we are in Seattle, we are in Toronto, we are in Charlotte, and we are thinking maybe of coming and visiting you and being with you in the UK. But to answer now your question, you cannot force people to be lifelong learners. You can provide them with the opportunity. Now, the cost of not doing it is going to be high. And that I agree with you, because if they don't do it, if they don't partake, for whatever reason, maybe because they don't have the time, maybe because they don't have the money. Your government, for instance, here in the UK is thinking of asking each company to set aside a percentage of its margin that will focus on lifelong learning. So you see, it's not only the learner himself or herself, but also the opportunity. And this is going back to the professor from Los Angeles, the Cal State professor from Los Angeles. This is where the endeavor is not only, you have a triangle, or even, you have four parties. You have the learner, you have the higher education at large, you have the employers, and ultimately also you have the government. And you know that the four players have to have a strategy and direction. In the United States, our approach to this issue of AI displacing jobs is a laissez-faire approach, saying it will solve itself. It happened before. That was the point you raised. New jobs will be created and people will flock to that. But there will be people left out, and inequality will increase.
There's one over here. There's the gentleman with the red scarf, I think.
I can use the voice if that's all right.
They can't hear you online then.
Oh, I see, yes. I do approve of your goals. I'd like to point to some use of technology which might enable one to reach that sooner. I think, to start with, we should recognize that artificial intelligence is perhaps one of the greatest public relations coups of all time. Journalists love it. And I think we have a tendency, therefore, not to notice that there are orthogonal directions in which we can think. And one way of typifying them is to think of the problem of artificial stupidity. Artificial stupidity is easily achieved. You build, rent, obtain a large office block, fill it with very intelligent people, preferably quite a number of high flyers, and you constrain them to operate within frameworks of rules that make the whole thing behave with artificial stupidity. And attacking that is something we can do with technology, making use of many of the techniques and ideas and so on that are used in artificial intelligence. What we need, this is something I've worked on for a long time, is a technology that harnesses the qualities of intelligence that people have along with those machines in a very flexible way. And we can do that by introducing a number of things via the technology that people have to control, really. Meanings, semantics. Meanings aren't made by computers. Even our best robots aren't going to do that. Meanings are established by people in the world we live in if we want to be at all comfortable. Also, when we're facing problems, artificial intelligence, I think bring it on. Let's get rid of a lot of junk jobs, but let's keep it under political control. Now, to keep something as powerful as that under political control means getting away from artificial stupidity and having administrative systems which make much better use of the enormous skillful exercise of inventiveness and judgment that people can bring into it. Now that requires this rather different technology. And I say the meanings need to be understood, but another crucial thing is responsibility.
Absolutely.
If you are going to have an effective organization, responsibility is the driving force of getting people to communicate with one another effectively. Now, this is something that can be harnessed usefully using technology, and I'm suggesting that let's have more artificial intelligence, but let us inquire in the direction of getting rid of the artificial stupidity, which is a matter of understanding how organizations function as information systems and deploying that new knowledge.
Absolutely. So there's a question here.
Thank you very much. In 20 years' time, it's not difficult to imagine that anyone who has a driving job as a profession is probably going to be at risk. I've worked with postgraduates for 20, 30 years when they leave university and they go into the corporate sectors, quite often banking. First thing you have to do is to actually retrain them. You put them on internships. If they come from computing, you have to teach them how to program. Quite often, they will say, well, I never learned this at university. Everything I've done at university, this now doesn't apply. Do you see, just like the driver's job is seriously at risk within 2 decades, do you see the academic's job is also at risk?
I thought that you were going elsewhere because I thought, and let me reintroduce it and then answer your question. I was discussing with our colleagues here about, we were involved, I was involved with the Bloomberg organization, foundation, etc., to look at, the future of work. And they surveyed the truckers. And they said, are you worried that your jobs will disappear? They said no. They surveyed also the unions, and the unions said, no, we're not worried. So I thought that, people are in denial in general. Now, if you're saying that, let's go back to your question. You're asking me whether higher education is itself at risk. So if we look at the mission of higher education, and I'm simplifying here once again, especially with here at the Martin School, so forgive me. But essentially you can look at 2 missions. One is a mission of education, and the other is a mission of discovery. That discovery that will change the world, that will change it today or may change it 100 years from now. So if you look at the 2 endeavors, no matter what, societies need knowledge discovery, need creation. And what society has done is to say, look, we have institutions that have been entrusted to doing it, and we are giving them advantages, depending from tax breaks to whatever it is, to not-for-profit status, etc. Now, similarly, when you look at the learning, when you look at learning, learning is a necessity. People need to learn. You said it yourself. So what I have been advocating in the book is precisely, let's make learning remain relevant. And let's make it relevant for life. Now, some of my colleagues, when I mention that, look at it and say, this is great because especially in the Western world is aging, and we have less students going into undergraduate education by definition. But if you look at it now, the opportunity is that the number of lifelong learners, it has increased dramatically. In the United States, it's over 68% already. So going back to your question, what is the function of and the mission of higher education? Is to provide learning and to provide knowledge discovery and innovation and rethink the world. Somebody has to do it, and it better be us.
Hi, good evening. I am a learner myself, and one of the most important things in my education was freedom from interests, from external interests. But once we're gonna have an education system which is integrated with internship, which of course come from big companies, then there is a problem of ethic, maybe, I don't know. This is basically my question. Is in the future education gonna be interest-free, or are we gonna have to basically guide our education path toward ethical compromise?
Look, you never want to start with ethical or compromise or end with ethical compromise. Let me correct something. The student, we don't mandate the internships, but 97% of the students do it. But they do it with NGOs, they do it with companies, they do it with organizations, and they launch various startups themselves, various endeavors. And we look at them and we say, what is the learning scope of this and how to integrate it? So you are in the driver's seat. If you see something and it's not, and you don't want it, don't take it. And if you don't see something, that's an opportunity for you to create it. We have many students who launched various startups as part of their internships in emerging countries, in Africa, etc. That's liberating. And so don't ever compromise on ethics. And if you work with a company, you're not necessarily compromising on ethics. But if you feel that you are, don't do it.
There's another question, sir. Oh,
thank you. Honestly, because I don't think you can fairly say everyone, honestly, what percentage of students and older learners will be able to master both humanics and lifelong learning?
Look, you don't need to master lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is a practice, is a habit that you need to have. You don't need to master it. In the same way that you walk or you use your bike or you go to gym in order to remain fit, that's your mental fitness and your mental survival. And in order to master humanics, it's like asking me how many people will be able to master a curriculum or a general education curriculum. Same thing. There is nothing specific to that. And I'm being honest.
Yes.
Hi, my question is in the digital age, is being a generalist or a specialist more relevant, and what is the role of domain knowledge in higher education? What is the role of that?
It's a great question. Look at, we have an engineer here. Look at this engineer, if I may, pick on him, because he has been picking on me. So it's my turn to pick on him. What is he doing now? He is looking at what? At education, correct? Mm-hmm. You're the pro Vice-Chancellor for Education. So if you look at your journey, and you look at his journey, look at my journey, look at my colleague's journey, and the many people here, you're not going to be a specialist. You're not going to be a generalist. You're going to be both. And look at the engineers who move in, you have two engineers. Once again, I'm simplifying, being simplistic. One engineer will remain engineer, the other becomes a leader. Why? They both mastered the technology, the framework, the algorithms, whatever it is. The other had additional dimensions based on humanics.
I should say I've been Pro Vice-Chancellor for 2 weeks. I'm going through a very intense period of experiential learning at the moment.
Yes, but I think that you were chosen because of this potential. And so we are waiting. I'll come back next year.
We have a question at the back.
Thank you. Is it your belief that a university education is there to provide a vocation? And if so, how does your experiential learning platform differ from a traditional trade school?
I hope that I never said that my belief is to provide vocation. My belief is that education has to provide a robot-proof journey, has to allow a robot-proof journey. See, that's a big difference. When the students are engaged in various experiential endeavors in pharmaceutical companies, or they launch their own companies to change the world, that's not being vocational. So I think that you are reducing experiential and equating it with vocational. No, that's not the point. And you can ask me now whether we need a vocational education or not, and I can provide an answer. But education, the purpose, I never say that it's the purpose is vocational. No.
Thank you. I'm not convinced, but thank you.
I don't need to convince you. You need to convince yourself. That's much more important. So I invite you to read a lot about experiential education. And you can start with the book. And then see the difference. Okay, you're making a kind of leap that is not the case here. That's all.
You mentioned that as a general rule, all jobs that can be made into a process could potentially are not robot-proof. Could you say something about what jobs you think will actually be around in, say, 50 years' time? What new ones there will be, and then also in what sense humanics-based education and experiential learning prepares us for those?
I would never. First of all, this is not my domain. But I'm not an expert in projecting. Which jobs will be there in the future, etc. But the premium, I can tell you, the premium is going to be on the endeavors that will require innovation, that will require creativity, that will require cultural agility, that will require the ability to see beyond the issue and say, I can solve it, I can create something new, I can be an innovator. Everything focusing on creativity, on innovation, on these aspects is going to be at a premium.
Is there one more question?
Would you have any advice to give to high school students who are in the process of university applications with regard to experiential learning and experiential education?
In general, my advice is the following. My advice is that you're embarking on a journey, and therefore your journey is going to be an exploration. So, for instance, you know, if you are in an institution, you take advantage of this institution. If you're studying engineering, why don't you start looking at a completely different domain? You know, in arts, media, and design, in the social sciences and humanities, combine that. Make your journey, you know, if you don't have Humanics curriculum, you can create your own curriculum. You know, you are in the driver's seat. No institution is going to provide you with all the needs and answers you are seeking. You have to shape them yourself, and that's why it is glorious to be a learner.
On that note,
thank you.
Professor Cowley will make a few closing remarks.
I think, first of all, we should thank Professor Aoun for a wonderful exposition and explanation of the thesis of his book. We should also thank the 2-week-old Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research, Martin Williams. I think Jim Martin would have enjoyed that a great deal. So thank you very much. Next door, there are drinks, which is also a tradition of the Oxford Martin Schools. So come next door, meet the speaker, buy the book. Thank you very much. Good night.